Hey there, it's Margie Bryce, your host of the Crabby Pastor podcast, where we talk about all things sustainability, whether it's sustainability in ministry, in your personal life, and we acknowledge that the church is in a transitional time, so we hit topics there too that are going to stretch your mind and the way you lead, especially how you lead yourself so that you don't become the crabby pastor. So, how do the pieces of your life fit together? Do they fit together well and things are humming along just fine? Or are there some pieces that are tight or absent or just not fitting the bill? This is your invitation to join me in my glass workshop for a video series where I am going to do a stained glass project while I talk to you about sustainability and building sustainability into your heart and into your life. So I am going to be doing my art, which is a form of self-care, and I'm going to invite you into that space with me, and I'm going to chat. I'm going to chat about self-care, and I'm going to show you how I create. And there's a nifty analogy. Stained glass seems to be a very good metaphor for what I want to talk about. So I'd love for you to join me. To do that, to opt in, I'll need you to email me at crabbypastor@gmail.com. That's crabbypastor@gmail.com. So you won't want to miss this. You definitely won't want to miss this. So make a plan to join me in the glass workshop. So this is Margie Bryce here today, and I am here with Josh Curtis, and we are going to talk about burnout. And I was pretty interested in what Josh has to say about witnessing burnout and what that looks like. From everybody thinks that if they're burning out, or pastors think that they can walk around and continue to do what they need to do, and usually they do, and they pull it off pretty well. I don't think I've heard of anybody like keeling over and passing out in the pulpit because they're burnt out, but it usually happens at some later point. So I was interested in what Josh has to say, and I'm going to let Josh introduce himself, tell us a bit about who he is and how he serves in ministry, and then we will talk about burnout. Josh.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to talk with you. As you said, my name's Josh. I've been either a part of ministry or in ministry my entire life. Grew up as a pastor's kid and took my first ministry post right out of high school at 18. I have worked at 5 different churches, 3 different denominations, a couple of really large churches, a couple medium or small churches. And so I've seen burnout from a lot of different angles, not just in my life, but in people I work with or work for, or my own family for that matter. Currently, I'm an associate pastor at Ben Naz and also a leadership coach, primarily works with pastors and youth pastors on things like this or any other areas that they need breakthroughs in. So, yeah.
So where's your church that you're serving at right now?
Bend, Oregon, Central Oregon.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a beautiful location.
I hear that. I have never been to that section of the country, so maybe someday soon. So anyway, I would like to hear how you came to identify burnout, see that it was burnout. And the part that kind of made the hair on the back of my neck stand up is working for somebody who is on the verge of burnout. I thought, oh, that sounds like just yards of fun. So give us your take on that.
Generally speaking, before I get into the story that I want to share, generally speaking, I notice with pastors a couple of things when they start to burn out. Probably the biggest thing is irritability, but I've seen pastors who are great leaders and excellent what they do completely change into a totally different kind of leader when they're burnt out. And irritability is usually kind of the first sign, but another sign is like in vision casting, it takes a lot of energy to work with a group of people, develop a vision and a direction, and then push it forward. And it seems like when people have burnout, they might start that process and then restart it and restart it and restart it, because when they try to push it forward, they're too tired to take it very far. And so they just redo it.
That's interesting. And first off, the first thing that you did there with what you told me was you validated the name of this podcast, right? Crabby
Yep.
Pastor. I did have one guy come up to me at an event and say, I'm never a crabby pastor. And he sounded a little crabby when he said that to me, but I thought, okay. And I said to him, well, go get your spouse and bring your spouse over here and we'll talk. And he didn't come back with a spouse either. So, but you have kind of validated that. That's kind of where we want to, what we hope to prevent, and hope that people have the humility level to, and self-awareness to say something's not right.
Yeah. Yep. And it may not just show up at work either. It might be something at home that springs up before it springs up at work. In my case, so the church I'm going to talk about is called Living Hope in Vancouver, Washington. And the pastor was somebody that my dad had led to Christ years earlier and had felt a call to ministry and planted the church out of the church that I grew up in. And it had grown exponentially. Like at one point, it was one of the top 5 fastest growing churches in the country. They were running 6, 7, 8 services a weekend. They were bringing in thousands of people. And there were, articles in Christian newspapers and stories and things like that all over the country about what was happening there. My story was a little different. I actually moved to Detroit, Michigan, and did ministry at a church there for 6 years. And when I came back, because my wife had gotten hired as a professor at my alma mater, we started attending Living Hope, and it was exciting. It was a really extraordinary service. A lot of people were coming to Jesus. It was billed as kind of a church for people who don't like church, which is a large market, by the way.
It's an exceedingly large
Yes.
market. Yes. And before
And
you go any further, this is like a personal side interest here, because I'm north of Detroit, right?
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, that's
So I was
right
like,
where it was at.
oh my God. Well,
Clinton Township, Mount Clemens area.
yes.
There's a church there called Cross Point that used to be First
Oh,
Baptist Church.
oh,
And
okay.
I did youth. I actually designed the logo on their sign. So if
Nice.
you ever
Okay.
drive by it,
Sorry for the detour, everyone.
that's okay.
I
That's
was like,
okay.
what?
Yeah, that's where my wife was born and raised in Detroit. So
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, you were talking about Living Hope, and I did do some pre-reading on the story about some of what happened, because here out in Detroit, we may or may not know that, unless like Christianity Today picks up on it and does a podcast series about it or something. I did this one, I totally missed, but I said to you earlier, this is like a Clint Eastwood movie. He did something called The Mule, and it's kind of a crazy thing. But go ahead, finish.
yeah, well,
Your perspective.
Yeah, well, and there was a major scandal years later, but we could start on the burnout conversation literally from day one, because I was working for a nonprofit in Portland, and their youth pastor stepped down. And so I was helping with the youth group. I was kind of thinking about stepping in. And so we did some interviews, and I ended up taking the position. And I'll never forget, it was December 1st, my first official day on the job as a staff member, as the high school pastor. There was another guy who was the middle school and college pastor.
At Living Hope?
At Living Hope. Yep.
Okay.
Now at this point, the church is 2,000, 2,500 members, something like that. The youth ministry is probably 150 or 200, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Hey.
So the pastor's wife calls me into her office on this first day of the job, and she says, the other youth guy is stepping down. And so we want you to take all three groups.
Mm.
And I'm kind of processing like services in my head and what's actually entailed. And I was like, well, there's two high school services and three middle school services and a college service. So you're asking me to take over 6 services a week for 3 different age groups.
Mm.
And her response was, actually, we want you to add a discipleship service Thursday night. So that'll be 7.
Hey.
I probably should have quit
The
that
day I
day.
started, yeah.
That day, yeah, because
Yeah.
you'd be hard pressed to find a pastor anywhere and who oversees 7 different services a week.
Now, how old
But
were you at this point?
2011, so I would have been early 30s
Okay,
at that
because
point.
I was going to say if you're in your 20s, you might think that's an okay idea. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it was my first large church, and so I
Okay.
had no understanding of like how large churches work or doing events on a large scale or managing.
Mm.
So I mean, a small church and a large church are 2 very different animals
Yep.
as far as administration. And I mean, I was excited to learn, but good Lord, it was like trial by fire.
I'll say.
And that was one of the hardest years of my life. I mean, it was the way they described it is they would say, people come into Living Hope and it's really hard for a while, but then they kind of get their sea legs under them and adjust to it, which is only partly true. But it was like just a can of burnout that first year. I mean, I was at the church all the time. I was scraping by to keep up with everything they gave me. My marriage relationship suffered a lot. I mean, my wife still has some bitterness towards what happened to our relationship. I mean, she remembers me coming home and just saying like, I'm spent. I have nothing left to offer today. And just having that be day after day after day, they would come up with things like, you know what, why don't we feed all the congregation hot dogs for lunch this Sunday? And Josh, why don't you cover that? And still on top of 7 services, I'd have to figure out how to make 3,000 hot dogs for the weekend service.
Mm.
And just stuff like that all the time. I mean, it was a total like sellout to whatever the church wanted. And they didn't pay anymore. I mean, they didn't pay me the guy's salary who stepped down.
Mm.
And a lot of times they would kind of fill the gap with God stuff, like, well,
Like, give
you
me an
don't do the,
example of that.
well, it's pretty common, you like, I understand that in ministry, you don't get into ministry to get rich. And I understand that, like, one of my professors in Bible college put it beautifully, which was that you want to work for a church that's generous, and generous looks different for different churches. So if you have a church that brings in 100,000 a year, and you're the only pastor, and they give you 60 or 70, that's an okay salary, but it's very generous. Whereas if you work for a church that's a multi-million-dollar budget and they give you the same salary, that may not be very generous depending on what you're doing.
Mm.
So generous in the context. They
Right.
were not very generous to a lot of their staff, mostly just their executives. But churches, and this is not just Living Hope, but churches will use God to close the gap between what they're asking and what they're paying, which is, like, you're doing this for God, or you're doing this for, like he'll
Making
reward you.
3,000 hot dogs for God.
Well, and it's not untrue necessarily,
Yeah,
but if you're using it to manipulate
yeah,
people and save money and you're taking a bunch of money, that's when it becomes a problem.
yeah. Okay.
And so it's something that a leader has to kind of search their own hearts with how they're using it, make sure they're not using it to be unfair to their staff. But it is true,
Sure.
you don't pay church leaders as much as, you pay hospital staff or in other industries sometimes.
Hmm.
So I was well, and a lot of the staff felt like this. I mean, things would change all the time. They change very quickly. And so we were constantly trying to keep up with the change. And that was culture wise, it was part of the secret sauce of why we grew, because it was always so exciting and interesting and you never knew what to expect. It was also the thing that burned people out a lot,
Hmm.
because everything was last minute, everything was urgent, everything, like there was a constant, I'm going to have to stay at work 3 more hours to keep up with this. And I'm going to have to, come in on my day off, and it just required you to keep putting more and more hours in to keep up with the last minute changes. And so some, I think that's a personality driven thing, as far as if a leader wants to have an environment where they can change things quickly. I don't think that's inherently bad. I just think they need to be cognizant of how that might affect the people they work with, and have some checks and balances, like
Yeah.
offering comp days, or paying attention to, we made a lot of changes last month, and where's everybody at? Do you need a long weekend or something like that with your family?
Sure,
Uh,
sure. And as you're talking, then I'm thinking about we are mortals. We
yes.
we have limitations, and one of those limitations is creativity, because that's what you're talking about, is a nonstop ongoing level of creativity, and it's for a good cause, right? You want people
Yeah.
to be attracted. You want people, you have to attract attention. That's what Jesus did with the miracles. He attracted attention to draw the crowd to then share the gospel. But we have finite creativity.
Well, and there's an ironic connection there, because, and this is, there's a book I wanted to mention as part of this conversation. It's by Tony Schwartz, and it's called The Way We're Working Isn't Working. And it's based on studies about burnout and health in the workplace. It's not a Christian book necessarily. But one of the things they argue that I thought was so fascinating about this conversation is that energy, creativity, productivity all come from the same source inside of us. You imagine like an energy bar that also fuels our creativity and our productivity. And I would add our ability to resist temptation, we'll say.
Would you say
And
that our ability to resist temptation increases when our creativity and energy levels decrease?
no, I think it all increases when we take care of ourselves, and
Okay.
it all decreases when we burn out.
Okay.
And I believe from what I've seen that there's a profound connection between burnout and, scandals or indiscretion. Like, we all have unhealthy things that we turn to deal with stress if we're not careful. And burnout makes it so much harder to resist those unhealthy things that we turn to.
And
And
this is a really important point.
yeah, oh,
In
I
the
I
age where,
absolutely think so.
and in this time where many churches are seeking to recapture the number of people that were there before COVID, and in many cases, they'll try to get that group back, which I always liken to, oh, let's go fishing in this little bucket, even though God has stocked the pond like crazy. Like you said, there's more
Yeah.
more people to engage that have never been a part of a faith community. But there seems to be, in some instances, a real franticness to get back to where we were before, when in reality, God may be asking us to move forward in new and different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I I am a huge proponent of the Sabbath. I would agree with the Ten Commandments in that regard.
Well, that's nice. That's nice of
But
you.
it's, I mean, it's, it seems like it should be a given,
I
but
know.
sometimes I wonder, because, there's passages in the Bible that talk about resisting temptation, that God will always give us a way out.
Right, right.
And sometimes I wonder, if we give in to temptation and we ask God, what was the way out that you gave us, if he wouldn't answer the Sabbath?
Yeah,
Did you
that would
keep the
that would
Sabbath?
probably be a good answer, because I always like to say, you can't load your pockets with change. Of course, in the digital era, that doesn't mean exactly the same thing, but it's a good picture. Can't load your pockets with change, get on an airplane, fly to Vegas, get in the middle of the casino and say, Lord, help me not to gamble. I mean, you've kind of
Yep.
set yourself up
Yep.
for that.
Yep. Well, and like we talked about, that obviously the scandals can really derail a ministry, but all that other stuff is connected too. I mean, it's connected as far as how you can push the vision forward. It's
Mhm.
connected to how creative you and your staff can be. It's connected to sermon writing and
Mhm.
lesson teaching and raising. It's connected to everything. And when that energy bar hits zero, it's there's a lot of different ways that can go wrong. And one of the ways it can go wrong is, without any scandal at all, the church can just coast, for years. But in the case of Living Hope, there was, you could see a lot of that in the staff and in the head pastor. I mean, you could see, he was dealing with some old injuries, and there were some pain pills involved, and there were some other substances and things like that. And I'm not like trying to get into the weeds of it to make it
Right,
a
right.
gossip thing, but just to say, like, more and more and more leaning on unhealthy ways. And we had no idea how bad it had gotten underneath the surface. But you saw his weight increase. You saw more. It was like he would try to take trips or try to take vacations, but it wasn't working. It was actually kind of funny, because we had about 40 people on staff,
Wow.
and we worked so hard when he was there that anytime he went on vacation, like, nobody would show up for work. I mean, it was just a ghost town. It was the funniest
Oh,
thing,
that's interesting. That's
because
interesting. And the other thing that you said that I thought was interesting was the weight gain. Sometimes that's food related. You got your stash of candy bars and you're just not eating healthy or whatever. That's one piece of it. But what I've come to understand as well is that if you're under a great deal of stress, your cortisol levels will go up, and you can be dieting. You can be, dieting, like eating healthy, working out or whatever, and you can still gain weight if your
yeah.
cortisol levels are out of control.
Well, and I gained a lot of weight while I was there, and that's one of my unhealthy go-tos, is like
Oh yeah.
stress eating. And when your schedule's overloaded, it's harder to plan for
Mhm.
healthier meals. But it goes back to your pocket full of quarters thing.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like, when you're on empty, you don't have the wherewithal to eat things you don't want to eat. It's just, you know, I mean, a different way of saying that is, like, there's a cheeseburger sitting on your desk and you're gonna grab it. You
right.
don't have the strength to resist, I suppose.
Well, maybe you don't have the resolve to really, that's just one more thing you've got to think about,
Yep.
eating healthy.
Yep.
And you
Yep.
just don't have the reserve to even contemplate that, especially if your creativity is being sapped
Yep.
repeatedly.
One of our college presidents used to say that the body and the spirit are so closely connected that they get each other's diseases.
No.
And I think that health plays a big factor, and it contributes to things like irritability and lack of creativity and mood swings and things like that. So and there was a lot of that on our staff. I mean, there was, people that were kind of living off of the extra chips after a potluck, or
Mhm.
that, you're getting donuts for volunteers all the time, and that ends up being your breakfast. And so, and the other funny thing, I mean, I already said it was really rough on my marriage, and there was a lot of marriages that were in a tough place. Some people actually ended up divorcing while working at Living Hope. And I remember one time the one of the executives was talking to me, and she said, man, it's like everybody's marriage is struggling. We need to bring in like a marriage conference or send you guys to a class or something like that. And I remember thinking, like, adding a class, like, like, stop making us work
Um,
70, 80 hours a week, plus maybe that will help our marriages.
maybe, but now let's be fair. Thinking about in the culture, all right, if somebody is married to somebody that is, say, going to be a physician, and they're in a residency program, and that's like ultra demanding. I mean, usually those are 2, 3, or 4 years commitment of, really intensive
Mhm.
time commitment. How do you think the church then compares or
Well,
that?
so I I have people close to me that one of them's actually in a residency
Mhm.
for her PhD right now. And I think that the difference is, especially in America, that's a pretty straightforward process. I mean, if you sign up for that, there's not a lot of wiggle room about what that's going to entail, even between the the top programs and the lower end programs of residency, like, you're going to have to sell out for it. And if you get married beforehand or in the midst of it, I mean, and that's maybe a different conversation about marriage coaching, but there has to be some kind of understanding that, like, this is what we're doing. In the church, there can be some of that, possibly, but the difference is that it's not a standard, it's an individual's decision on a regular basis, and they're deciding to make this change, which will cost their whole staff a number of more hours, and then just continually doing it, just continually borrowing against it and borrowing against it. Now, if you work at if you work at a hospital, depending on the type of work that you do, there can be a lot of emergencies or call-ins, or you can end up working all hours of the night. But that's not necessary. And I'm obviously not a doctor, so I'm theorizing at this point.
Right, right.
But it's not necessarily your boss, waking up and going, I have a creative idea that'll cost all my doctors an extra 10 hours this week.
Mm.
And so there's an element of leadership and culture and structure. But I would also say, like, I don't want a burnout doctor working on me, especially if it's a
No,
serious injury. Like, I don't I and I've heard of, some hospitals looking at things like this, of, like, could actually be dangerous.
hmm,
Airline pilots are the same way. You don't want an airline pilot that it hasn't slept in 2 days or something like that. My neighbor's actually an airline pilot. So I I I do think that, a place for like working hard, selling out, putting in long hours, but at the same time, especially in a church, there is like you're a shepherd of your staff. And I think that a church should be a place where you bring both together, where people work at a high level and also care for their families at a high level. I can't tell you, I mean, this is another huge issue for me, but like, I don't want my kids to hate the church.
Mm.
And they don't have a concept of like, working for God necessarily. It's basically just the church versus me. And so me as a kid. And
Right.
so like with my son, I'm real careful about how I talk about my commitment to the church and my working at the church, and also talking to him about, I was gone at a camp this weekend, and so I'm going to take Monday off just to be with you, because and even say things like, my church is going to give me Monday off because they want me to be able to spend time with you too, because that has a huge effect on his relationship with God and his spiritual life.
Sure.
And so, and that went both ways at Living Hope. I mean, we had some great pastors' kids who had a good relationship with God, but a lot of times it was kind of in spite of the church,
Were
more
there
so
some
than
staff
because of it.
members that were better at carving a boundary for that out? I mean, that's kind of my glimmer of hope that I see with younger clergy today, is that work-life balance really matters, as opposed
Yeah.
to the clan of the folks at my end of the spectrum that really, which I never wanted to work that way anyway, personally, because I'm crabby. I'm crabby. I'm not fun to be around, not that I always am, but I mean, if you're taxed, you're just not
Yeah.
fun.
Well, the shift is from a generation that considered work as life
Mhm.
to a younger generation that is work as part of life.
Mhm.
And I mean, in many circles, it's pendulum swung too far. I talk with a lot of employers that are kind of pulling their hair out with young people,
Mhm.
just trying to get them to show up. And so
Yeah.
there is taking it too far. And I think that, in any job, we're supposed to do it with excellence as unto the Lord,
Mhm.
whether you're a doctor or a pastor.
Mhm.
But there's there's this weird dynamic about being a pastor, is that there's something about your relationship with God that you feel like should be able to be mimicked, right? Like you're a tour guide of life with God. And if you operate in such a way where you're exhausted and it's hurting your relationship with God, and it, and there's that huge disconnect there. I mean, you feel this, like, you might even get in a place where you're mad at God or disillusioned at God, and then you got to go up and tell people how to get close to God, and it's like
I know. Well,
it's
people
it's a hard
people
place to
have done
be.
this. It is hard, but people have done that.
Oh, I've been there. I've definitely been there.
Yeah.
And I, back to your point about being able to say no and carve out boundaries. Yes and no. I mean, you could get fired for saying no. And part of
But
what,
how could you get fired for I mean, aren't there
yeah,
employment rules and
a little more now, but it was part of the thing about a church that has a lot of momentum, is that there's a lot of people that want to work there,
oh,
you know, naively. It was always funny because people are like, "Oh, I'd love to be on staff, or I'd love to work," and you just feel like, "No,
no.
you wouldn't," but you just think you would. But because of that, there's a line of 10 people for every job. And so if you drop the ball enough, I mean, they've got plenty of people waiting for your job,
Hmm.
which kind of enables them to lean more heavily on people. I would say that for me, I learned a lot about, raising up leaders and delegating and letting things go and pushing back on my boss in ways that, and I feel like I tried to build a trust and reputation to be able to do that, especially with other staff members. I mean, like, they knew that I was working hard and they would have my back, if I got in trouble about something. And you just learn to navigate it. And it was still hard. I mean, it was a lot of work till the day I left, but years 3 and 4, I got much better at navigating that kind of schedule and that kind of, but a lot of that was me learning to carve out space and mold the job into something that was a little more feasible.
Hmm.
It wasn't because of their help.
Okay. Well, that
you
was,
know
that probably was the most valuable learning while you were
well, there's a ton of things I learned that were
yeah.
amazing. I took a lot away from it that I still apply. And when there was a big scandal, and the head pastor ended up stepping down, and his wife and a few family members that were working for the church all had to leave. And you can read all about that in the article. But one of the things that happened when they left is that we brought some people in to relook at HR and staff structure and scheduling. Some of the pastors that stuck around were given sabbaticals and things, and some of them are still there. I mean, this is a dozen years ago, and they're ministering strong and revitalized, and they have a much healthier staff structure now, even as a larger church that has a lot of ministry going on. For me, one of the things that was interesting to me, because when I left Living Hope, I became a campus pastor for another mega church in Portland called Abundant Life. And it was, the load was so much more manageable than working for Living Hope. And the support structure, the staff, just the supports they had in place were remarkable. But I found myself like kind of overloading myself and being back in a position of being overwhelmed in other ministry positions, and kind of having this realization of like, nobody's doing this to me. I'm doing this to myself.
Hmm.
And I've wondered about that, because I don't know just what, like, if those were patterns that I picked up in an unhealthy environment and then just kept them right into better environments,
Oh, wow.
you know,
Wow.
and impose them on myself. It's
Yeah.
like you can get to a place where you you don't feel comfortable unless I mean, it's kind of an oxymoron, but you don't feel comfortable unless you're like overwhelmed and too busy. There's something that feels normal about it.
Some people have said that you can almost like get addicted to
Yes, that's
that.
a good word to use.
Yeah.
Well, and I
And you
think,
have to do that. So,
and I think that for me personally, the best measure of that is on a Sabbath day. I
mhm.
mean, if I hit Sabbath with my family and I feel guilty because I'm not doing anything, and I feel like uneasy and twitchy because I don't have any like that, to me is I'm addicted to work. It's a
Yeah,
pretty
or
tall
addicted to
sign.
the chronic, I got to keep going. I got to keep going. I can't,
Yep.
it's kind of like you're trying to
Yep.
juggle and not let the balls hit the ground. And it just, yeah.
Yep.
Well, I
Absolutely.
think, I think too, that's a great place to stop. I want you to, can you remind us of that book the title of the
Yeah,
book,
the
and the
book
author, and I'll put
was,
that in the show notes.
yeah, sure. The book is The Way We're Working Isn't Working by Tony Schwartz.
Okay, because there are some things we can indeed learn from or unlearn from some secular authors. But I want to thank you very much for coming on and for sharing. And maybe somebody will hear this and God will be speaking to them, and we could have one less crabby pastor out there,
I
which
love
would
it.
be
I love it.
which would be a
That's
great
awesome.
thing. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Are you wondering whether your fatigue, your lack of motivation, your lack of interest is burnout, maybe? I just wanted to let you know that I have a resource on the website, margiebryce.com. That's BRYCE, margiebryce.com. And it is a burnout questionnaire free for you to download and kind of self-assess and get a sense of where you're at. And there are questions that not only ask about what you're going through, but maybe how often you're experiencing it. And that's kind of a key to where you might be, because you have to know where you are in order to chart a course forward. And most pastors and ministry leaders who experience burnout rarely know that that's where they're at until they're well into it. And if you're unsure about that little statistic, so far everybody that I've interviewed on this podcast who has experienced burnout, when I ask that kind of question, they're like, yeah, I didn't know that's where I was at. So again, go to margiebryce.com. It's on the homepage of the website, and you can get your burnout questionnaire and kind of see where you're at. Hey friends, the Crabby Pastor podcast is sponsored by Bryce Art Glass, and you can find that on Facebook. I make stained glass, that's part of my self-care. And also by Bryce Coaching, where I coach ministry leaders and business leaders. And so the funds that I generate from coaching and from making stained glass is what is supporting this podcast. And I will have opportunities for you to be a part of sponsoring me. And as always, you can do the buy me a cup of coffee thing in the show notes. But I will have some other ways that you can be a part of getting the word out about the importance of healthy self-care for ministry leaders. Hey, thanks for listening. It is my deep desire and passion to champion issues of sustainability in ministry and for your life. So I'm here to help. I stepped back from pastoral ministry, and I feel called to help ministry leaders create and cultivate sustainability in their lives so that they can go the distance with God and whatever plans that God has for you. I would love to help. I would consider it an honor. And in all things, make sure you connect to these sustainability practices, so that you don't become the crabby pastor.